We're happy to have two distinguished guests with us today. George Price, a professor at the University of Montana, teaches African American and Native American studies. He runs a permaculture farm on the Flathead Reservation outside Missoula and has been very active in climate change resistance and fossil fuel resistance. Welcome, George.
Well, thank you.
Sarah Van Gelder, who's the editor-at-large and co-founder of Yes Magazine, who met George on a road trip that she dubbed The Edge of Change. And I understand, Sarah, you're formulating a book out of those experiences.
That's right. Glad to be here.
Yes, thank you both for joining us during Climate Week. I hope today we can talk about some of the cultural shifts that offer promise for a unified action against climate change. Sarah, could you start us off by talking about some of the things that you saw on your Edge of Change road trip that you found inspirational and suggestive of ways that we might be able to move beyond political debate and rhetoric and move towards civil action on climate?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Just to give you a little background, we started Yes about 20 years ago, and we were interested in the question of how people are creating a more just and sustainable and compassionate world. And so 20 years later, I went on a road trip because I wanted to see for myself whether some of the stories that we have been reporting on are adding up to the kind of change, the deep change that we need. So I went on a road trip leaving last August. I was gone for about 4 months, and I visited places in the West, native reservations. I visited in the Midwest, places like the Rust Belt cities that have been abandoned by corporate capitalism. I visited Appalachia, visited the South, went all the way to Newark, New Jersey. So I went to the places that I don't normally travel to because I wanted to find out what's happening at the edges of society, not necessarily in the power centers. So I'm writing a book, as you said, and it's filled with stories from that road trip. But let me just tell you about one of them, which is in southeast Montana, where George is, a different part of Montana that George is from, where there was a proposal to dig the largest coal strip mine in the entire state of Montana at the Otter Creek Valley. And what I was able to witness there was the resistance to that coal mine, resistance on the part of both ranchers who had been there for generations, raising cattle, living a quiet lifestyle, and the native people of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation who've also been there for generations. And the word just came out in the last month or so that Otter Creek mine proposal has been canceled. The resistance ended up winning. But what was so striking to me at the time, when that was still up for grabs, was how much the language of the ranchers and the language of the native people, how similar it was. Both of them were talking about how the land had been in their family for generations, that the land and water were sacred, and that they had responsibilities to turn that land and that water over to future generations in just as good condition. And even though the ranchers were very clear that the native people had been there for, of course, way, way, way longer than their families had been there, they had begun to understand in that deep way that people are connected to place, they're connected to the earth, they're connected to each other. And that level of connection is so much more important than the immediate short-term profits that a corporation can get by digging up the coal and leaving these devastated landscapes behind. So that was a real moment of hope for me.
And did you see bridges being built between those communities?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I was honored to be at a ceremony that took place when people from the Lummi tribe, which is out here on the West Coast, arrived there at the Otter Creek site with a totem pole that was a gift to the people, the Northern Cheyenne people. And at that ceremony, there were both ranchers there and there were native people, and native people from various different tribes. And the sense of collaboration and mutual support was really very moving.
That's a wonderful story. George, you were part of a resistance action, we mentioned this a little bit in the introduction, called Megaload protests, which were efforts to stand up against vast quantities of equipment that were heading up to Alberta, Canada, to work the tar sands fields up there. Can you share a bit about those efforts and how that experience may have given you some hope for the future?
Yes, I'd gladly do that, Reed. Thank you. Back in the winter of 13 and 14, 2013-14, we got wind that in December there that these big hauling outfits that were going to be hauling this oil sands equipment or for the tar sands in Alberta through our town, Missoula, there. And we'd seen it before and resisted it before and protested. And our allies down in Idaho, the Nez Perce people, had also had a successful resistance to this just a couple of months before. And so they were going to bypass the Nez Perce land, the road the highway that went through their lands and come up the valley south of Missoula. And so as soon as we got word of that, our organization, Indian Peoples Action, which operates out of Butte, Montana, but it's statewide, and a non-native interaction activist group, Northern Rockies Rising Tide, who has also members in Missoula, and we got together and began planning a resistance. So that was one of the first things I wanted to point out. This is an interracial, intercultural movement, and like the movement Sarah was talking about in eastern Montana. And so a couple of us from Indian Peoples Action, Michael Lynn Hawk and myself, and Kathy Littleleaf, decided to suggest that we have a round dance in the middle of this highway, the biggest street going through town, in front of the truck bringing the oil sands equipment. And these are enormous trucks. They even have to move some of the street lights out of the way to get them through, and they take up both lanes of a 4-lane road. I mean, they're taking up nearly 3.5 lanes, and they're very large pieces of equipment. And so a round dance, for those in your audience who might not know, is a traditional social dance. It's somewhat of a welcoming dance, not, a mystical, spiritual, or ceremonial activity, but a social activity in which you dance in a circle holding hands and with hand drum singers, usually in the middle of the circle, and we had drummers and singers with us. And then at some point we break one line out of the circle, and they go around shaking hands. So there's an inner circle and an outer circle. Beautiful ceremony or activity, let's say. Symbolically, that was our way of reaching out to these human beings who work for these big haulers, people who probably don't have any vested interest in the success of fossil fuels other than that they have a job right now doing this, right? And so we, in a sense, we're letting them know that they can come join us. We're not against them. We're against the corporate machinery that sees fit to do the devastation they're doing up in Alberta. And much of our motivation for all of this was solidarity and compassion with our brothers and sisters up in Alberta, And so we were welcoming them, in a sense, to join us. And we had some signs, and long story short, we had 4 of these actions in those between about the 1st of January, when the first load came through, and the 14th of March. Our largest grouping of people there was about 80-something people. And many of these folks were in their first public protest action. They'd never done this before. So we would meet beforehand, and we never know when they're going to bring the haul through, because they do it in the middle of the night, like at 1 to 1:30, but they don't tell you when. So we had spotters up the highway about 20 miles with cell phones letting us know when they were coming. And so we had about 4 people, elder women, who chose to get arrested. And we told everybody beforehand. There was a lot of activist education going on, training, and beforehand, that nobody's obligated to resist and get arrested. And we realize that the dynamics for our tribal people getting arrested are going to be a little different from people with means to pay bail money and who might not have any outstanding warrants or anything like that, as some of our people did, So we let people know that we'll resist to the last minute before they arrest us for those who don't want to be arrested. And we had 4 people on 2 different occasions choose to get arrested. Long story short, after our last protest in our last blockade in March, they didn't bring any more of those through. But what they decided to do is break up these mega-sized equipment loads into a size small enough that they can get under a freeway overpass and haul them up and reassemble them up in Alberta. And they actually built an assembly plant up there just south of the tar sands. So, in looking back and evaluating the success of this protest, we understand they spent $9 billion reconfiguring these their hauling methods and all that, and building the assembly plant in Alberta. So we did give them something to think about.
And you're talking in a language that maybe
that they might understand.
Yeah, a corporation might understand.
Yeah,
which is the cost of doing business and whether it's cost effective in their view to go through this process.
Right. It was a communication activity.
Because you're talking about kind of 2 different styles of communication. The method that you were trying to communicate to the haulers themselves, that we see you as humans.
Yes.
And we're not talking to you about money. We're not trying to disparage you trying to make a livelihood.
Yes.
And then to the corporations, we are disparaging you making a livelihood out of mining.
Yeah, that's true. And we're also communicating with our allies up in Alberta and our fellow humans who are being victimized by all of this, letting them know that we have people here who are empathizing with their very painful circumstances, suffering all kinds of rare forms of cancer due to these operations up there, losing loved ones and losing their natural resources. These are fishing people up there, and having to make choices like, do I eat the fish with these gigantic tumors on them, or do I stop eating fish and fishing altogether? Or, choices that no human being should be forced to make,
Yeah, I wonder if we might bring Sarah in here to talk a little bit about that kind of, whether you saw that elsewhere, as we start to see changes that are visible in the climate due to exploitation that's basically monetary and short-term gain over long-term health.
What I found on my road trip is that for a lot of people, the climate is something they're very aware of, but it's a little bit more in the background. And one of the reasons is I think a lot of people don't feel like there's anything they can do immediately. But I think it informs an awful lot of what people are doing. So, for example, I found almost everywhere I went, including places where I wasn't even asking the question, I found people very involved in the local food movement, really interested in how do we bring food production back to our own communities, not only community gardens and farmers markets, but a whole food system so that we can eat locally again. So there's climate reasons for doing that. There's so many reasons for doing that. There's climate reasons because if you're in the Midwest and you're importing all your food from California, and California is in the midst of this huge drought, you start wondering, well, does it really make sense to be bringing in food from a place that is going to be impacted this way by the climate crisis, when here in Illinois, for example, we have so much water and so much land? Why exactly are we doing this?
Well, and it starts to, I think, affect things like family budgets, or the question you had about health. I don't know whether is this the healthiest food I could be eating if it's trucked
Exactly.
halfway across the country.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many things where food becomes a really critical issue. One of those, another one is health. Another is a sense of cultural sovereignty. Is this the food that makes sense for me, for who I am, and who my culture is? Is this the food that I visited this wonderful farm in Kentucky that's run by immigrants from Central America, and they wanted to have the same kind of food that they had been growing in Central America. And so they formed a cooperative with a bunch of different people, and everyone grows some part of that menu, and then they share together. So they're both creating their sense of community, a sense of celebration of their culture, coming together, connection to place, connection to the earth, to their own bodies and their health. There's so many levels on which food production makes sense. And of course, climate is one of them. But people tend to see things very holistically, so it becomes part of a larger picture, not a single issue activity for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned people bringing cultural food habits to the table and thinking about how they can produce food that feels like home or feels like their own culture. And we've seen a lot of polarization played up in mainstream media about immigrants, about different levels of economic means and geographic plays. Is that the whole story, or are there some examples of commonality and unity that either of you have seen?
Well, I think, both of us talked about examples of commonality and unity. I think that is the trend among the common people, or the people who are becoming awake to many of the issues of not only economic injustice and climate injustice and all of the impositions and destructive activities going on. People are beginning to unite across all of these traditional divisive lines that were initiated by colonialism, the divide and conquer techniques that brought in race theory and divisions between people. People still have unique concerns that are specific to their home and their own communities, and yet with this wonderful device called the internet, we're beginning to communicate not only across the nation, but there have been a lot of intertribal communication between U.S. tribes and Canadians, and now internationally in Latin America and around the world, that we seem to be facing common adversaries. I'd rather use that term than enemies, but that these adversarial forces of economic exploitation, that we all seem to be facing that, and being able to come up with solutions together that can work in various locales and various cultural groups. And what Sarah was beginning to mention there is the food sovereignty movement in indigenous communities, which we're real excited about. And, as a longtime organic farmer living on the Flathead Reservation these last 30 years, I'm beginning to see, even though the Salish and Kootenays are not traditional horticultural tribal cultures, this ability to relieve ourselves from the health concerns created by colonialism and commercialism through taking charge of growing our own food is beginning to spread. And I'm a descendant of people of the East, Wampanoags and Choctaw people, and Africans and indigenous Europeans too at one time, but I've lived with the Salish and Kootenai people for over 30 years, and this has been developing really the last couple of years, independently of anything I'm doing, but people know about our farm, and we've interacted. There's other organic permaculture farmers on the reservation too, besides myself, I should say, quite a few, and it's beginning to catch on slowly but surely. There's a lot of obstacles still to overcome. People have been sold on sugar and salt and crunchy things just like the rest of the world. But there's this movement towards the wonderful experience of independence that people gain when they can take care of themselves, whether it's through hunting and gathering traditional plant foods or fishing or growing your own food. This is a very exciting intercultural interaction. So we have native and non-native farmers on the Flathead Reservation teaching, learning from each other.
And building a new economy that doesn't require...
Right.
I mean, just sort of as a side effect almost.
Yeah, it doesn't require dependence on the industrial, technological, capitalist system, and I think, ultimately that sort of independence will cause these oppressive systems to crumble. If people come to the point where they are no longer dependent on their products and can do for themselves, those corporations are going to have to adjust mightily or be replaced by a whole nother economic system. Now, that sounds like a dream to a lot of folks today still, but with the dire circumstances that we're facing, I think across all cultural lines, people are starting to see the need for some kind of fundamental change, not a Band-Aid approach, but a real fundamental reconstruction of society. And this is evident, of course, in our political arena right now.
Well, income inequality is something that's getting a lot of attention.
Yes.
But you're suggesting perhaps another way, which is to say we don't have to play entirely on that scale. Let's look for different ways to organize society and maybe the edges of the culture are interesting places to look for that happening, Sarah, where there are people who are outside of the perceived forced consumerism of suburban or urban areas and can start to explore things like grow your own, roll your own.
Yeah, I had a wonderful time in Detroit, Michigan. It's one of my favorite places to visit when I travel because there is such a creative spirit in that regard. What you find is a city that's been largely depopulated because of the crash of industrialism. So there's space. There's both physical space for people to turn land into farms, and there's kind of a psychological space too because of this sense of everything is not about those, shoring up those industries. There's the possibility of something else to emerge from what people want in their own communities. So Detroit has a very active urban agriculture program. Lots of people growing food on some of those abandoned lots. Sometimes they're just squatting on the land. They're just using it, and the city is glad to see someone using it. In other cases, it's more formal. But there's other things too. There's like people who are doing these swap meets where they bring together the stuff that they don't want and trade it for things that they do want. There's cooperative daycare. There's just this very exciting kind of sense of possibility that this is a place where a new world could come into being because there's that kind of room, because people want something different. They tried that 9-to-5 thing. And it worked in some ways, but in some ways it just eats your soul, spending all your time at work and at assembly line.
Well, when it became 9-to-5 plus another job, plus trying to figure out how to take care of the kids, plus, then it isn't such a good deal anymore.
That's right. So I think there's a real openness. I attended a conference in Detroit the year before called New Work, New Culture, which is basically saying, we don't want to bring back the old job system. We want to create a whole different kind of a culture where we can do more for ourselves, as George was just talking about, and do more for each other and make it a part of our creative expression in life, make it part of how we want to live and how we want to be with our family and our neighbors, not just one more way to plug into some kind of a global corporate machine.
Yeah, that really is exciting. And what is accompanying that is a replacement of the rugged individual, ultra competitive culture of the past with a very cooperative, interactive, democratic culture, and this is evident in the co-op movements and all the other types of cooperative enterprises that people form. Here's one in Missoula, Montana that's very exciting called the Missoula Time Bank, where people exchange services and sometimes goods, but mostly services, and log in hours doing things for each other. Maybe somebody's a plumber who fixes somebody's sink, somebody else is doing another thing like roof repair, or somebody sews, or somebody's just a good caretaker for people who need physical help.
Mm-hmm.
And you log in your hours at the time bank, and you have credit where someone can come and help you. And there's no money exchange. There's no need for currency in a system like that.
And stuff gets done.
And stuff gets done very directly, and people relate to each other, and they have a new sense of being a part of a community together. And again, across all of these traditional divisive lines that colonialism gave us, very exciting time to be alive. And a lot of us have been looking for this for, all of our lives, going back to the 60s. I'm 64 years old and experienced communal living in my young, naive years where we didn't know what the heck we were doing. And drifted away from that. And now I'm coming back to a sense of deeper possibilities again, and I see this happening on a broad scale now, internationally too. You hear about communities in Europe and elsewhere engaging this, and then indigenous people worldwide who've been doing this forever, living cooperatively and with the earth, not against the earth, becoming people that others are actually listening to now. You don't have just the industrialists coming into their world trying to destroy that. There still are plenty of those people. We don't need to have any more of that. But you also have people coming to learn from them and take that back to their home countries. I'm just glad to be alive now, even with all the scary elements of our present scenario. It's brought people somewhere now. I think ultimately unknown possibilities for reform right now. And you know why I'm not despondent and I don't have despair about climate disaster is because I realize more and more that I can't predict the future. I can't predict the power of activism, of consciousness raising, and how far it might go. Things are happening faster than I previously imagined they could, So it does give me something to sink my teeth into and keep committing whatever time I have when I'm not working for the man. Looking to retire soon and then really get busy, And so this is a great time.